I hope you've seen the introduction to Daniel, because it will set up the story for what is to come. But let's get started in chapter 1. Let's hear verses 1 and 2.
In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim king of Judah into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God.
There's a difficult timeline to follow concerning Nebuchadnezzar and King Jehoiakim, but we'll try to decipher that as we go. And there are honestly different understandings of it in commentary, but I'll try to lay this out as best as I can. In 2 Kings 23:37, we see very clearly that Jehoiakim was 25 when he began to reign over Jerusalem for 11 years. And it specifically says that he did evil in the Lord's sight. From right here in Daniel 1, we're about to see that in Jehoiakim's 3rd year, which means that he was about 28, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem, and actually Nebuchadnezzar took him to Babylon, but sent Jehoiakim back as a vassal king. In 2 Kings 24:1, we see that after 3 years, so that means Jehoiakim's about 31-ish, he rebelled and didn't pay tribute. Well, in Jeremiah 25:1, we see that Jehoiakim's 4th year was Nebuchadnezzar's 1st year. If we reference back to Daniel 1:1, how then could we see that Nebuchadnezzar's siege in Jerusalem was before he became king? Well, there's some details behind that story. Nebuchadnezzar was a general under his father, King Nebuchadnezzar. And depending on the culture documenting the event, kings' reigns were counted differently. So, for instance, the Jewish method of counting was to count the reign from the beginning of the new year preceding a king's ascension. However, the Babylonian method was to count the reign from the beginning of the new year following the ascension. And then there's a third methodology that sometimes we'll see, is that they'll count it from the actual date of the ascension. So we see in Jeremiah 36:1, in Jehoiakim's 4th year, Jeremiah wrote all the words God had spoken against Israel, Judah, and all the nations. So he made, let's say, a pamphlet of sorts, combining all of those things. And then we see in Jeremiah 36:9-31, in the 5th year of Jehoiakim's reign, that is supposedly in December of 604 BC, he heard the words written by Jeremiah, and he didn't appreciate the words, and he actually ended up burning them. At that, the Lord really set things into motion for Jehoiakim's demise. And in 2 Kings 24:2, it says, "And the Lord sent against him bands of Chaldeans, and bands of Syrians, and bands of Moabites, and bands of Ammonites, and sent them against Judah to destroy it." Then, in accordance with the prophecy in Jeremiah 22:18 and 19, also 36:30, Jehoiakim was disrespected by being killed, first of all. Secondly, his body was thrown over the wall of Jerusalem. Third, it was buried outside the gates. Then, of course, Nebuchadnezzar then placed his son, Jehoiachin, on the throne, and he was 18, but he still, of course, did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Well, the practice of taking young people back to your own country to train them in your own way is not uncommon. Not uncommon back then, and evidently not of contemporary times. Even in the late 1970s, Russia attacked Afghanistan. They took Afghan youth and put them in the University of Moscow to train them and then send them back to Afghanistan as leaders. Well, obviously that didn't work because, honestly, the United States kind of messed that plan up. Vodi Bakum noted that in the ancient Near East, they weren't godless. In fact, when a kingdom would overtake another kingdom, they would take the people and their gods to show that their gods were tougher than the captured gods. This is the case in verse 2, where the Babylonians took vessels from the house of God. It was a tempted statement that their gods were better. You kind of have to ask yourself, how did Nebuchadnezzar and crew know what to take? Well, there's a story behind that. About 100 years earlier, King Hezekiah was looking for alliances to go against the Assyrians. And as we recall, the Assyrians were particularly brutal people. Well, this all showed that he really didn't trust that the Lord was going to take care of the kingdom. And the Lord didn't appreciate when he had the Babylonians come in and he showed them around all the treasures of Israel. So therefore, the Lord prophesied the Babylonian exile to Hezekiah in 2 Kings 20 and Jeremiah 39. And this was all 100 years earlier. And it was really sad because Hezekiah expressed relief that it was not going to happen in his lifetime. Well, in verse 2, we also see a strange name there we don't see very often, Shinar. Actually, Shinar is an ancient name for Babylon. It's also mentioned in Genesis 10 and also in Genesis 11. It's another name for Babylon.
Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans.
Well, the Babylonians knew who to target, and so they targeted the royal family and nobles, and happened to get, of course, Daniel and his crew. It's interesting that Ezekiel was also in the batch of young men who were taken.
The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego.
We see in verse 5 that the king was treating them at a very high level. He was treating them with the very best of the kingdom from basically his own table. His own chefs were taking care of the captives. They were getting the best education that was available, and it was going to be a 3-year university MBA education, so to speak. But we see in verse 7 especially that the renaming of the individuals was going to be one more way of removing their old culture, because names have meanings, and if you change the meaning of someone's name, it changes the way they're perceived, the way maybe they perceive themselves. Now, Daniel's Hebrew meaning was God is my judge. The Babylonian name, Belshazzar, with a Babylonian meaning of Prince of Bel. Bel-Marduk was the head god of the 13 or so gods that the Babylonians followed at that time. Azariah means in Hebrew, Jehovah has helped. The Babylonian name given is Abednego, and it means servant of Nebo. Nebo, of course, another one of their gods. Mishael, Hebrew name is who is what God is. The Babylonian name, Meshach, which means guest of a king. Then Hananiah, which means God has favored. In Hebrew, Shadrach is what it was changed to, what he was to be known by, and that meant the great scribe. So there are 4 main points that we can kind of draw out of the Babylonian method to take the old culture out of their captives. Number 1, physically isolate their captives from support, obviously. They were captive in Babylon, which is about 1,000 miles from where they came. Mental indoctrination, we saw that in verses 3 and 4. Identity alteration, obviously changing the names of the individuals. We saw that in verse 7. and then, unfortunately, probably castrating them as eunuchs. And this was even prophesied in Isaiah 39:7, which says, "And some of your own sons, who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." Not sure how much more specific that you can be. Well, this was a common practice because if somebody's going to be around the palace a lot, it was done to make sure that none of the servants would sleep with the queen and taint the royal line.
But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food, or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself.
Verse 8 tells us that Daniel was quite resolved, meaning decided. But based on the evidence of God's seeming inaction to save them from being captives, it would have seemed reasonable that Daniel would go along to get along. It was presented with opportunity and welfare, but Daniel knew he was still part of God's plan. Daniel saw through the scheme of Satan to pull him away from God and decided not to defile himself in any way. We got to consider the parallel of Joseph finding himself in a strange land. Really, he was literally sold as a slave. Most people probably would have turned their back on God, who, by all evidence, had turned his back on Joseph. Well, like Joseph, Daniel knew better. He knew that God had a bigger plan. So he decided to learn and to serve the kingdom that God had placed him in, but would not defile his body with their ways. Daniel's conviction to honor and please God always outweighed the temptation to fear and to please man. Daniel's response to all these things was personal resolution, a personal decision. And we see that in our lives, where we need to make decisions on how far we will go with any particular item that the world has to offer. We can pull some wisdom from Proverbs 4:23. "Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life." Romans 12:2. "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." Then finally we see in Colossians 3:1 and 2, "Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth."
And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs, and the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, "I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king."
So clearly from verse 9 we see that Daniel has been given favor with those who are over him.
Then Daniel said to the steward whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, "Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see."
In verse 11 we can see easily that it's not the chief of eunuchs that relented to Daniel, actually. It was the steward who was assigned by the chief, but the steward probably recognized that the chief liked Daniel. So it worked out. The Lord worked that out, obviously. Verse 12, it's interesting that Daniel refused the food and the wine. And it's possible Daniel had some knowledge that the food had been sacrificed to idols, but why go vegetarian, which is not a practice mentioned in the Old Testament, and vegetables could also have been sacrificed to idols. And why refuse the wine? Jewish life consisted of the use of wine regularly. Well, the likely reason, according to commentators, is that it would set them apart and continually remind themselves that they were different, and they had a purpose. And the purpose was not for Nebuchadnezzar, but it was for the Lord. Deciding so, the Lord blessed that decision and grew their bodies and their minds with what was put into the body. The Lord provided.
So he listened to them in this matter, and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables.
Well, Gary Hamrick brings out that the word fatter just means more ripped and ready. And scholars are split on the matter of who got to eat what, and who it was taken from, and who was it given to. Some think that they just limited the diets of the 4 men, but others think that it limited the diet of all the young men from then on.
As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar.
We see in 17 that not only did these guys study the subjects assigned, they were given greater insight from God. God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. They gained some stuff from 3 years of study, there's no doubt, but they were given a lot more by the Lord in order that they would fulfill the purpose of what the Lord put them there for. We can equate that to most anyone. In Romans 12 says, each of us has gifts according to the grace given us. Well, in 18, we see that there has been a 3-year jump, and the guys are still faithful, still pressing forward, not revolting. They're not trying to run away. They're in the middle of God's will and doing what they have been told to do. Paul LeBoutillier brought out a really good comment that, if you train a child, the scripture says if you train a child when he's young, he will not depart from it. Well, this is a clear indication. These young men were trained very well by their parents or somebody before they were captured. When they were captured, they continued to follow the Lord under great amount of testing. And after 3 years of being trained in a pagan society, pagan literature, pagan everything, they were still faithful. Paul LeBoutillier brought out that our children, if we train them well when they are young, no matter what secular society, secular universities try to teach them, they should be able to come out on the other side relatively unscathed. That was a pretty good comment.
And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the 1st year of King Cyrus.
Well, as it turns out, Daniel would serve the kingdom through several administrations for 70 years. I'd like to put this in a contemporary perspective. What if the leader of, for instance, North Korea, Kim Jong-un, would get a hold of the United States? He would come, he would take you back to North Korea and tell you that he's going to educate you in the North Korean language. He wants you to learn their culture, their literature, and then you're going to be an advisor to him. Well, I have to admit, this free American would have a very difficult time in doing that. But that's what happened to Daniel and his friends. They were taken to a completely different culture, a pagan culture, and told they were going to serve. And that's what they did, because they knew it was a part of the Lord's plan. So how much do we trust the Lord? Bad things happen. How much can we trust that the Lord's will is being done as bad things are happening? Apparent bad things are happening to us. Well, thanks for checking out chapter 1. I hope you enjoyed it, and looking forward to putting out chapter 2. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.